There's something in me that rebels against trying to talk about thousands of years, and millions of people, billions of people in tiny little sound bites. But what are you going to do, right? Okay. So Asian religions and American transformations. Asian religions, that's a pretty big catch-all category, isn't it? The two that the book is going to talk about are Buddhism and Hinduism. What else could they have talked about, but really don't? Other than a few mentions here and there. What else do we lump into Asian religions?
Like Taoism?
Mm-hmm. That's a big one.
Confucianism.
Very good. Yeah.
Shinto?
Shinto, yeah. That's probably enough to work with. I mean, if we had a world religion class, we'd actually spend time on each of these. And we, the way I set it up, we'd spend at least 2 weeks on Buddhism, at least 2 weeks on Hinduism. Here we're going to do it in 30 minutes, both of them. Again, this is the slice that we have here in America. So we're not going to get very deep into it. And, another thing that they do mention, let's just call it Chinese folk religion. There's all these sort of things that are rolled in together. I mean, we could also talk about Cao Dai, or the sort of new indigenous North Korean religion that the North Korean regime has put together. That would qualify as an Asian religion. But this is already a very big basket. Buddhism is one that we'd want to focus on, in part because it's one of the big 4 world religions, and in part because it's not a religion that is tied to just one ethnicity. Confucianism is not just tied to Chinese ethnicity. It plays a major role in Korean culture as well, and to a lesser extent in Japanese, but primarily it's Chinese. You could say the same thing about Taoism, of course, Chinese folk religion as well. Shinto is largely, a Japanese thing, which sometimes gets fused in with these others. Hinduism is tied in with India, but there's over 1 billion people in India, and there's a lot of Indian immigration. It's the 3rd largest world religion. So it does make sense if we're going to focus on 2 things, we're going to focus on these 2. And your book talks more, I would say, about Buddhism than about Hinduism. They make a distinction very early on that I think is very useful for talking about these religions in America. And you could use this for other things that are being imported as well. They talk about ethnic religions. And I think number 2 is, export. And elite religions. So when they're talking about ethnic religions, they mean religions that are actually tied in with people's particular ethnicity. So they get brought to the New World by Asian immigrants or refugees, and they're practiced primarily within their own communities. They use Pure Land Buddhism as an example of that. Most people who are Pure Land Buddhists in the United States are a part of an ethnic community, or they've married into that ethnic community and become assimilated to it. So that's part of why if you want to talk about American Buddhism, you don't hear a lot about Pure Land Buddhism. Instead, you hear more about export or elite ones. Export religions have their origins in one of the ancient traditions, but they've emerged in new aggressive forms like Japan's Soko Gakkai, which we'll look at, which is actually considered a new Japanese religion, but you can also lump in with Buddhism. They've been brought to North America by missionary-minded adherents, and they've sought converts not so much among ethnic Asians. And when we say Asians, that's kind of, I pointed this out, that's a weird term because, people from South Asia, say the Indian subcontinent, are ethnically as different from Chinese, from East Asia, or Koreans, as they are from Westerners, as they are from, Middle Easterners, pick whoever you like. But we lump it all under Asia, so, that's what we do. Elite religions, he says you could also call these import, are those strains of Buddhism and Hinduism that attracted considerable followings among well-educated Americans seeking alternatives to Christianity and Islam, largely in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So Zen Buddhism would be an example of that. A lot of people got into something that they called Zen. Some of it was authentic, some of it was just sort of like putting together things at random and calling it Zen, which was still going on by the time that I was starting to look at religions and sort of play around with different paths. And when you hear people talking about Hollywood Buddhism, that's what they mean. That sort of, pick and choose, I like these spiritual practices. I suppose you could say that the contemporary mindfulness stuff, which is sort of like, Buddhist and sometimes Hindu meditative practices stripped of all their religious content, would actually fit under this elite designation as well. So, your book talks about all three of these as being important. For the history of these religions in America, the ethnic and the elite are the ones that show up earlier on. The elite happens pretty early in American history because people like Emerson and Thoreau, Walt Whitman, start getting interested in what people call Eastern mysticism. And by that they meant Asian religious texts, like in Hinduism, the Upanishads, or whatever they could get their hands on as far as Buddhist texts. Not too many of them were available back then. They were more attracted to Hinduism at that time. The World's Parliament of Religions in 1893, that played a major role. That was put together by this Unitarian who wanted to, actually create a forum where Americans could get introduced to other religions. And so it drew a lot of attention. It was sort of a catalyst for people beginning to study this kind of stuff. Your book also mentions Open Court Publishing and Paul Karras, who published Buddhist texts in accessible form. All of that's on an elite level, Very little of that trickled down to the ordinary person in the street. A little bit with the beatniks, back in the 50s and 60s. You guys probably have seen some, film references to them, or it's been mentioned in your American history or literature classes. They really didn't have much influence, though, on larger American culture. They were always a subculture. In terms of ethnic religions, what we have are largely on the West Coast, Asians coming in, mostly Chinese, some Japanese, to work. And there was a lot of restrictive immigration rules put into place gradually to actually try to keep them out and reduce the community that was there. And your book talks about some of these early temples in San Francisco. I'm going to skip over that a bit. Then shifts, after mentioning Pure Land Buddhism, to talking about Buddhism itself. So it's kind of good to have some conception. There's a lot of diversity among the way Buddhism is actually practiced and even conceived of, but there are some things that most Buddhists are all on the same page about. One is, there's this guy, Siddhartha Gautama, who becomes the Buddha, the enlightened one. And he's in India. He is from not the highest class of people, but the second highest, what they call Varna in traditional Indian society, the Kshatriya, the warrior class. His father was actually a local king. And his father tries to bring him up without any sort of, seeing bad things. Just like, I think when a lot of you have kids, you're going to want to shelter them. Maybe you guys have been sheltered a bit. Parents wanted, a better life for you than they had. And so they try to keep you from having to work crappy jobs, or how else do people shelter you? Try to keep you from seeing people being mean to each other. We don't do a very good job of it because we let kids play these violent video games, bully each other. But we do a lot of sheltering, right? His dad was the ultimate helicopter parent. Tried to keep him, and he had a lot of resources. Tried to keep him from seeing anybody get sick. God forbid anybody dying. It was just nice all the time. That doesn't work. I mean, you can try that sort of thing, but sooner or later you're going to run into some of the things that lead you to see that life is indeed crappy. What are some of the fundamental things that we can't avoid that make us sad or upset? What's been in your experience so far? You guys are pretty young, but yeah.
Like death?
That's a big one. I mean, this is going to be a downer. Either you're going to die, pick anybody you like. Either you're going to die before they do, or they're going to die before you do. Or you're going to die at the same time. It's unavoidable. Over human history, the death rate is 100%. You can't get away from it. So that sucks, right? If you come from a big family, that means lots of baptisms, but also lots of funerals. What else? What else is not fun about life? Yeah.
Being sick.
Yeah. I mean, you can work out all the time and eat healthy and still get MS or have a heart attack or pick whatever you like. The heart attack probably leads to death, but you get the idea. And we could go down the line with all these sorts of things. There's all sorts of suffering in life. And so the Buddha, before he becomes the Buddha, he sees a wandering Hindu wise man, an ascetic, and he says, I'm going to try that out. This world isn't so hot. I'm going to see if I can liberate myself away from this world. By the way, another thing that goes into this, for us in the West, we tend not to believe in reincarnation. We believe one shot around is it. So if your life sucks this time, at least it'll be done after it's done. In the Indian subcontinent, they believed in reincarnation. So it sucks this time. It's going to suck next time. The only way to maybe have it not so bad is to behave in accordance with the rules, and then you might have a less sucky life that time, and it could get better and better, but it's still never going to be really great. Even the gods are not happy, and they're at the top of the food chain. They're not perfectly happy. So the Buddha has this moment of enlightenment, and he comes up with what are called the Four Noble Truths. And guaranteed, there's going to be somebody who will comment on this and say, oh, you should have translated it this way, or you got this wrong. But I don't care. We're going to put them up here and get them out on paper. There's different ways of translating and parsing these things. But generally, most people agree that you can say the first noble truth is all life is suffering. Everyone, can agree with that, right? All life involves some suffering. Now, what makes us suffer? That's what takes us from being a pessimistic, whiny sort of thing to actually having some sort of idea, yeah.
Well, eventually everything comes to an end, and that end makes us sad.
So impermanence. Now, why does impermanence bother us?
We get attached to things.
Exactly. So, suffering is caused by, you can, parse this out in different ways, desire or attachment. We want things to be as they are, to continue the way they are. Fall in love with somebody, it's great. you want them to stay the same. They don't stay the same, now you can't stand them. But unfortunately, you got yourself married to them, or you're engaged, or you don't want to break up with them because X, Y, Z, or something like that, right? Marist looks great at first, then you realize this wasn't the place for you. Or maybe, you're pleasantly surprised you find out that it was. In any case, notice this, that you figured out the cause, right? If you know the cause, you can start working on it. You want to end your suffering, stop being attached to things. Stop having desires. Then you're not going to be disappointed. Now, how easy is that to do? Let's say you accept this, and I say, you come to me, Dr. Sadler, I'm unhappy. And I say, well, your unhappiness is caused because you're too attached to things. Just stop being attached to things. You go, oh, thanks, great. Now I'm fine. Is that how it works? Is that how it works with anything? I don't do my homework, until the last minute. I'm going to stop doing that this semester. I said that to myself, over and over again as a student. And does just saying it change anything? What do you need to change things?
Motivation.
You guys are pretty successful, What were you going to say?
Motivation.
Motivation is nice. It's good to have it. What does motivation have to turn into?
Action.
Yes. So, how do you do it? He's got this eightfold path. And it includes all sorts of elements, right? Like right living, following certain ethical rules. Not getting drunk is part of it. As a matter of fact, if you're a strict Buddhist, you're not supposed to take any sort of intoxicating, mind-altering substance, mind-clouding substance. One that's often observed in a breach, as we say. It also involves having to meditate. So meditation is done for religious purposes within Buddhism. It's not just to clear up your skin or, be more relaxed or something like that. It's ultimately to answer the great questions in life. That's why one meditates. And there's a whole, community, which is called the Sangha, that is oriented around this. And the Sangha consists of basically two kinds of people, monks and nuns who actually live this full time, and then the rest of the people who are sort of contributing to their livelihood, getting prayed for by the monks and nuns, probably taught by them as well, but who can't do this full time, but can at least observe the precepts. And perhaps reincarnation actually is kind of a nice thing in putting things in perspective if you believe in it, because if you're not able to be a monk, and you can just contribute to a monk, maybe next time around you get to be a monk. Then you get to be liberated. Whereas, from a Western perspective, if you can't have it in this lifetime, then it's no good, right? So, now how is this actually lived out in communities here in the United States? Your book talks about a few different major ways. Your book also misinforms you a little bit about the ultimate origins of these things. Pure Land Buddhism and Zen Buddhism ultimately have their origin in Chinese Buddhism. And from there they go to Japan. So it's not technically true that they're entirely indigenous Japanese groups. Buddhism had a very, very strong influence and long development in China after it came from India across the Himalayas. And then eventually, it goes to Tibet, which at that time was sort of like the Wild West. We think of Tibetans as being like super, nice, easygoing. They were the tough guys of the time. Usually the people who are missionized last are the ones who are the toughest and meanest. So the Tibetans and the Mongols got the same sort of Buddhism transmitted to them. Pure Land Buddhism, I'm going to go over this very quickly. Pure Land Buddhism is not so much centered around meditation as centered around appealing through prayer and through offering devotion to Amida Buddha. Amida Buddha is a bodhisattva, and a bodhisattva is a being who decided after they could have crossed into enlightenment, nirvana, however you want to put it, to come back to save all other beings. And they took a vow not to actually cross over until they'd saved all the rest of the universe. So Amida Buddha creates a pure land. And so if you do things right, he'll let you in there. Then you can actually work on enlightenment. And the reason why, your book doesn't tell you this, but the reason why you would want to do that is it's too distracting out here. In the time of the Buddha, it was okay, but there's so many more distractions. And he's talking about like 500, 600 years after, it crosses over. There's so many distractions that it's just not possible for most people. So to be merciful, this bodhisattva created this perfect land in which there would be no distractions and you could work on enlightenment full time. That's essentially Pure Land Buddhism in kind of a nutshell. There's a lot more to it, but we won't go into it. Zen Buddhism is what's more familiar to a lot of Americans, and it focuses on meditational practices instead. There are rituals, but many Americans sort of dispense with them. There's two main schools. One focuses on sitting meditation, very tough to do, at least in my experience, because you have to sit and you start by counting your breath. Don't think about anything. And so you start out, 1, 2. Man, I'm getting pretty good at this. Nope, you thought about something. Start over. And, you got to get to 10 before you're actually ready to do anything else. I never got past 4, myself, when I tried this sort of thing, because my mind is easily distracted. There's also another sort of tradition within it, which consists of using these teaching parables called koans, like the one about what is the sound of one hand clapping. There's a couple different possible answers to that, including one of them being, in any case, that's another major example of Buddhist stuff here. Soka Gakkai is, in some ways, more like Pure Land Buddhism in that it's less focused on meditation and more focused on devotion. It's coming from Nichiren Buddhism, which taught that the sole path to salvation was this Lotus Sutra, which is a very important Buddhist text. And they do a lot of chanting and meditation focused on that. And then finally we talk about Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhism. Not all Tibetan Buddhism is actually, technically speaking, Vajrayana Buddhism or Tantric Buddhism, but your book says that it is, so we'll just go with that. There's a couple other things that are brought in, particularly mudras or hand gestures that are supposed to have cosmic significance. Mantras. You guys know what a mantra is? It's not something that, by the way, came from Tibetan Buddhism. Something that came into it from Hinduism originally. Mantra is something you say over and over and over and over again. Sort of like a chant. And then mandalas. Mandalas are these circular artworks, sometimes created with sand, sometimes, tapestries. And if you know how they're set up, you're supposed to be able to use them as a meditational device to understand the entire universe. They created a beautiful mandala shortly after 9/11 out of sand in New York. some Tibetan Buddhists. Now, like it says, Buddhism also exists in a variety of other forms in the United States, but these are primarily focused on ethnic communities from East and Southeast Asia, which arrived either as immigrants or as refugees from war. That's probably enough about Buddhism. It was very fragmentary, but now we do need to talk about Hinduism, which, you know, on a world scale, if we're just going by numbers alone, is in certain respects more important. Hinduism has been the dominant religious tradition of the Indian subcontinent. And that's been historically one of the major centers of culture in the world, and population. Hinduism actually spread outside of India itself to get to what we call Greater India, while it was still kind of a missionary religion. So that's why you can find Hindu temples, for example, in Cambodia or in some Indonesian islands, because the influence was spread so far. But now it's primarily an Indian thing. Like your book points out, there's no one single thing that we can actually call Hinduism. It doesn't have the kind of unity that, say, Christianity, despite being spread into a whole bunch of different denominations, or Judaism, or Islam, or even Buddhism has. In part because it's a bunch of different practices and local, sects or cults all kind of rolled into one, unified around some grand themes, with a whole literature, not all of which everybody reads or acknowledges, but some texts are more central than others. So if you look at one person who's a Hindu as being representative of Hinduism, you may actually get sort of a skewed or very partial view. So like a book says, it has no datable beginnings. It's an unfounded tradition with roots in a prehistoric past, largely from the Indo-European invasion of northern India, which sort of superimposed elements of traditional Indo-European religion onto a matrix of peoples that were already there, already had practices in place. It's developed in a variety of directions. It has a long lineage of sacred texts, all of which are revered, but not all of which are actually read or utilized very widely. Your book talks in particular about the Bhagavad Gita, sometimes called the Song of the Lord, which, by the way, you can get for free if you want. You just write to the Bhagavad Gita Society and they'll send you a copy, because they're doing missionary work. And this is actually a chapter from a much, much longer epic work called the Mahabharata. And it tells this story about the hero Arjuna caught in a situation and his conversations with Krishna, who is actually Vishnu in human form. Krishna teaches Arjuna the three disciplines, or yogas. When you hear this term yoga, we often associate yoga with people carrying around these mats and going to the studio and chit-chat afterwards and namaste and maybe having a yogurt smoothie together. But really yoga means something much more than that. That's only like the tiny, those are physical exercises that are supposed to actually be like liberating your body, or liberating your mind from your body. And they've been turned into an exercise routine for many people. Real yoga is supposed to be something that frees the soul from the body. So there is, yoga in the sense of these physical routines. And if you want to know more about it, read Patanjali. He tells you all about this in the Yoga Sutras. But there's other ways of doing it too. Karma yoga. Karma yoga means actually sort of like doing your job for the sake of doing your job. And right now your job is to be a student. Or a son or a daughter or something like that. And you can do it for self-interested reasons, or you can do it as an offering to the divine. And that will free you. Another way is through jnana yoga, which is essentially doing Indian philosophy, studying the sacred texts and thinking about them. Sacred texts would include things like the Upanishads. There's a lot of other things as well, the Vedas. And then there's Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti means devotion. And this is actually the way that many Hindu people practice their religion. They're not doing it so much by going to, study philosophy. Some are doing it through karma yoga. Some are doing it through Raja Yoga, the subordination of the body to the mind. But many are doing it actually through devotion to a god, entering into a one-on-one relationship with whoever it is that you're going to take. It could be Vishnu, it could be Shiva, it could be Kali. There's a lot of different possibilities. They're all understood as being God, images of God. And the way that you do bhakti is by, giving offerings, like going to the temple and bringing flowers. If you ever go to an Indian temple in India, it's amazing colors, because everything is decorated, and then people will bring flowers. They bring fruit. There are special meals that are cooked and offered at home to a statue of the deity. And it's understood that this is a way, and this goes all the way back to the Vedas and to ancient Indo-European religion, that it's a way of bringing the spiritual into existence with the physical. And the model for this is sort of welcoming a guest into your home. Think about when you bring somebody home. For instance, you take somebody home for Thanksgiving. What sort of things would you do with a guest in your house? Keep the house clean? Yeah. I never thought of that, but that's actually an element of this. Yeah, that makes great sense.
We have to do that before the holidays and stuff at our place. So.
Yeah, that's very smart. Yeah.
Offering them food and drink.
That's a big part of it. The offering of food and drink, hospitality. What else? There's usually conversation, right? You don't just all right, go over there and watch TV. I've got stuff to do. You make it a relationship. That's part of what goes on in bhakti, is entering into a relationship with the God. Your book gives you a number of different sort of examples of things that most Hindus do believe, and they've tried to codify them into kind of a creed. The existence of one supreme being, an endless cycle of creations, preservation and dissolution, the seeking of moksha or liberation from the cycle, karma, meaning the law of cause and effect, determining where you're going to be the next time around if you haven't gotten off of the wheel. For example, for many traditional Hindus, to be born here in America means you did something wrong in a previous life. Because if you'd done better, you'd have been born in India, where you actually could have been exposed to a proper religious upbringing and had some ideas about how to live your life. If you're born in a bad situation, probably did something wrong in a previous life. If you're born in a good situation, probably did good stuff in a previous life, but don't expect that that's going to carry you over in this life to the next life. You better act right in this life. There's a whole sort of ethics built into this notion of reincarnation. Providing worship to divine beings at the temple and the home, puja, following a spiritual master, the pursuit of nonviolence, ahimsa. And here's something else that's kind of interesting about Hinduism, a recognition that spiritual truth is to be found in other venues, other religions, not only Hinduism. It's not the case for all Hindus. There are what we call Hindu fundamentalists who don't see that. Now, your book also then talks about something that's really interesting, How do you live this out in America? One of the central aspects of this is the building of temples. It says the defining act in the emergence of an American Hinduism has most likely been that of temple building. Why? Well, it's, a temple is like a church or a mosque or a synagogue. It's a place where you're not just an individual or a family that practices, you are part of a community. And again, as with American Islam or American Buddhism, quite often this means a mixing of ethnicities. Not everybody who's Indian thinks of themselves just as Indian. It's usually, where are you from in India? What language do you speak? What occupational group do you come from? So building a temple, like they say, is not simply the erection of a house for worship, but an act of reestablishing a relationship of people with tradition. Establishing new roots now that the old ones have been forsaken but not abandoned. Your book talks about a few different examples of Hinduism in America, particular groups. With the elite religion, we could talk about Vedanta, which is actually Hindu philosophy, right? And most people are not studying philosophy. That's not how most people do their religious life, right? Transcendental meditation, which that was a big thing in the 60s, the 70s. It's pretty much, gone as any sort of important force today. But it was an adaptation of yogic meditation techniques. India has also contributed export religions. The one that probably you might actually have had some contact with are the Hare Krishnas, or the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. And, like I said, bhakti is about, worship, a devotional relationship with the God. And they're a group that carried out a lot of sort of evangelization, mostly among white Americans and Europeans, and attracted them to become Krishna worshipers. So this involves, food offerings, ritual dancing, ritual singing. Where you might have seen them would have been at places like airports. Because it used to be, now after 9/11, it's very difficult to do this sort of thing, but it used to be that you could go to the gate in airports. When I was your age, I used to go, pick up, friends or girlfriends, and you could meet them at the gate, and nobody questioned you. Well, there'd be these Hare Krishnas, and they'd be dancing around and drumming and singing and looking for offerings from people. That was their form of evangelization. Airports were seen as like a perfect place to do this because people are coming and going, right? And they'd give out tracts. So that's probably a good place to end.